15 years ago, we had only Premier Padmini and Ambassador. And now there are plenty of cars available which are internationally available like Hyundai, Honda, Opel, even Mercedes and many cars.
Today you see in the last 3-4 years drug prices have quadrupled in India. So a paracetamol strip which used to cost something like 1 rupee 50 paisa about 4-5 years back today costs around 7 or 8 rupees.
A lot of call center mushrooming happened in Bombay in the year 1999, and since then it's been on a roll. The best part about call centers is the job opportunities it's given to the youth.
Even though there are full vacancies when teachers retire, I'm speaking about college and school teachers, they are not appointed on a regular basis. So people come on a contractual basis at a much lower salary, on a piecemeal basis, appointment for 1 month, appointment for 6 months, and these teachers have no rights at all. The worst sufferers are the students, because they have to be teachers who do not have a stake in the system, and the examination system also collapses.
There is a common thread running through the starkly different realities of a new India. A word that we have heard thrown around every now and then. A concept that we need to understand. Globalization, simply put, means the breaking down of barriers between nations.
Globalization becomes a problem when it becomes profit-centered, market-driven, and forgets people. Let me give you two simple examples. In South Africa, the government was taken to court at the WTO by the company which was manufacturing an AIDS drug, because the South Africans were able to get this drug cheaper from another country. The principle is very simple. People could die, but the patent holder should not lose the ability to make profits. Another example, in India over the last few years and over the next few years, the price of drugs will go up 800%, but our inflation every year is just 5%.
So let's take a journey to 8 decades ago, when the globalization of today started taking shape.
After World War I, because of the unjust Treaty of Versailles and the Great Depression, the economic situation in Germany gave rise to Hitler and, in the course of time, to World War II.
After the Second World War, the countries of the world realized that unless something was done about the deep economic disparities or even economic injustices between nations, we would have one world war after another. And we needed a more civilized way of dealing with these issues. At the same time, communist countries were offering a new way of living which seemed to offer more to the poor.
The capitalist nations reacted to the spread of communism with the introduction of containment liberalism.
By offering economic aid to the newly developing nations, the newly independent nations, they hoped to contain the spread of communism.
So in 1944, the IMF, that is, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank were set up at Bretton Woods in the USA, with the aim of helping the economically disadvantaged countries improve their economies. Then in 1945, there was an attempt to set up a General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or what we call the GATT.
All these were genuine attempts to really help the poorer countries and to make sure there was no economic injustice in trade relations. India too was helped. We moved from being a food deficit country into being a food surplus country. And the things that helped us were, for example, the technology that we received that helped us for the Green Revolution, or the food that we received through the PL 480 funds.
Soon after World War II, many countries started gaining their independence, and the political pendulum started shifting.
Once the United Nations was set up and a number of new countries started gaining independence, they started making their voice felt in the United Nations. And because many of them felt that they had been economically raped by the colonizing nations, very often, though they were grateful for the aid they received and were still receiving, they often voted against the interests of the Western nations.
These newly developing nations, called the South, were still economically dependent on the West until in 1970, Gaddafi, the ruler of Libya, decided to nationalize the oil industry in his country. Oil industries, which had been under the control of Western companies. The price of oil shot up by 50%. Gaddafi had set an example. Following in his footsteps, the Middle East oil-producing nations, known as the OPEC, all decided to take control of their own oil. The price of oil shot up by 400%. Then in 1974, the other countries of the South banded together and passed the new International Economic Order. This new order demanded economic reparation from the North.
What this meant in effect was, just like the oil-producing nations had nationalized their oil resources, other countries in the world started nationalizing whatever lucrative industry was being run by Western companies on their soil.
Thus, the economic balance too was shifting. Finally, militarily too, the confidence of the West dropped. When first the French and then the US were humbled by peasant guerrillas in Vietnam. Then again, in the late 70s, the US could not get its hostages released in what was known as the Iran hostage crisis. The West decided to fight back.
They did this initially by trying to break the unity that was building up among the southern countries. One of the ways they did this was by buying off the Saudis. They allowed the Saudis to invest in US Treasury bonds on the condition that the Saudis would not support other nations who are trying to get together to do the same thing with other raw commodities, which the oil-producing nations had done with oil.
In 1979, Thatcher came to power, and in 1980, Ronald Reagan, both with the avowed intention of gaining back the preeminence of the Western powers. Three other events helped them.
The Western countries started tapping into the oil resources in their own areas, in the North Sea and Alaska, and so their dependency on oil decreased. Or, through technological means, they were able to find substitutes for raw commodities like sugar, for instance.
But what helped them the most was what was called the debt trap.
When they gained independence, the World Bank and many other institutions gave a lot of loans, what they call dollar loans, to the poorer countries to help them develop themselves. Unfortunately, they said that these loans have to be paid back in dollars. Now, let us assume I took $100 in 1980 as a loan. At that time, a dollar was 8 rupees. So actually, I got 800 rupees worth of aid. 20 years later, the price of the dollar is 50 rupees. So now I have to pay back 6.5 times what I actually received, because now I have to pay back 5,000 rupees for the 800 rupees I received, plus the interest on that 5,000 rupees, which means I'm paying back at an interest rate of about 700%. Obviously, I cannot do that. I did not receive so much money, and I have not become a rich enough country to be able to pay that. So, I end up having to borrow more money in order to pay back my earlier loans. This is what is called the debt trap. As a result, poorer countries were completely under the control of the World Bank and the IMF. And the World Bank and the IMF always had as its head a US citizen. That's by virtue of its constitution. So when Thatcher in 1979 and Reagan in 1980 came, this debt trap offered a kind of simple way of controlling the poorer countries. What they told the poorer countries was, obviously you don't know to manage your economy, so we'll tell you how to manage your economy, and then only will we give you further loans.
And so, aid was offered on condition that the poorer countries accepted a structural adjustment policy, or SAP.
That meant stop spending all your money on looking after your poor, on health, on education, and other kinds of things which the poor need, and start spending it on things which will help the market, like roads, bridges, etc.
This meant that while, for example, the prices of cars and cell phones went down, the prices of medicines and cooking gas went up.
The budget for the other services is higher than the health budget, like road constructions or the flyovers, etc.
It also meant taking away the sovereignty of the countries, because now the World Bank and the IMF controlled these national policies.
The IMF and World Bank have told all governments, the third world countries, that they should not spend money where there is no profit. Education is a field where there is no profit, and therefore subsidies are being cut. In order to cut subsidies, they are converting regular colleges into no-grant colleges, regular courses into self-financed courses, and regular appointments into contractual appointments. So it's a whole conspiracy to defeat the very purpose of education.
Many countries did not want this, but the debt situation became so bad that by 1986, 12 out of the 15 biggest debtor nations accepted the SAPs.
This doctrine was called Neoliberalism as opposed to the earlier containment liberalism.
The belief that they were selling was that the government does not know to run anything, therefore hand it over to the private enterprise, but to the point where everything had to be handed over. Basic needs like health, education, even water. And the principle was that they would make a profit on this, and as a result, the benefits would trickle down to the poor. A fact that history has shown is not true. The second principle was the principle that the market should hold sway over all national policies. And therefore, the market should decide the price of medicines, not the need of the country. So we had to withdraw our drug price control order so that the market would control the price of the medicines. Automatically, the prices of medicines go up.
पहला मैं ये बिजनेस में आया तभी इसका 80 पैसा कॉस्ट था, आज इसका 15 रुपया कॉस्ट है.
The SAPs demanded that there would be clear rules for trade between nations so that the poorer countries would not be treated unfairly. That was the promise.
So in 1995, the World Trade Organization, or the WTO, came into existence.
The WTO was different from the United Nations in that it had the right to impose economic sanctions on any country which broke the rules. Because this was so powerful, it was decided that the World Trade Organization decisions or laws would be made not by majority vote but by consensus. That means every country had to agree. So it sounds like a very good rule, but in actual fact, it worked in favor of the rich countries. How did this happen? They first made a rule that it must be a consensus vote, but they also said that in order to have a negative vote, that means if you want to vote against something, you must be present in Geneva for the meeting. Now, 29 countries in the world cannot afford to keep somebody in Geneva, so their vote is out. The remaining poorer countries can afford to keep, say, 4 or 5 people in Geneva. It's costly to keep somebody in Geneva for the full time. But in a year, the WTO has about 3,000 meetings, which means about 10 meetings a day, and you have 4 people. So when you're going for a meeting, you can go for 4 out of 10. So in 6 meetings, your vote is out because you cannot vote through fax, you cannot vote through email, you cannot give power of attorney to anybody else, you have to be present. While a rich country would come with 400 people, so that means at each meeting, they would have about 40 people attending. So when you're having a discussion, you have one person here and you have 40 people here, obviously the ones who are 40 with all the background that they have would win. But besides all of this, suppose in spite of all of that, a poorer country said we still disagree, then they would be threatened bilaterally. That means they would be told that if you don't vote for this, then we will stop this aid or that aid. So then a poorer country which is dependent on aid cannot afford to vote against a rich country. However, on the other hand, if a rich country decides that it doesn't like a rule, it can just say no, and it needs to be only one.
Finally, at the ministerial meeting in Seattle, USA, this unhappiness came to a boil. The entire process of the WTO erupted, and the meeting had to be cancelled.
The poorer nations refused to allow these backroom discussions to become law.
A further attempt was made at Doha in Qatar, and then again at Cancun, Mexico.
By this time, the poorer countries had got their act together, and so India, Brazil, China, and a number of other countries got together and stuck together despite all the threats against them.
In spite of this, a number of issues are still to be thrashed out, one of which are those relating to intellectual property rights.
Intellectual property rights are what we know as patents. Now, patents in themselves are not bad, but when the right of the patent holder to make profits, as in the South African case, becomes more important than people's right to life, then something is going wrong. And what makes it even more crazy is when patent holders start demanding the right to patent life forms which do not belong to any human being. A good example of this is the neem tree. In the USA at the moment, there are 29 patents on the qualities of the neem tree, which means, except for that particular patent holder, nobody else can make any product from the neem tree using any of those qualities. What the rich countries want to pass is that these patent rights in one country should be applicable universally, which means that such a patent holder in the United States would be the only one in the entire world who could make products from the neem tree. This is patently wrong and unjust. It is also a way of what we call biopiracy. They cannot come and take over the properties of these plants or take over the biodiversity of poorer countries by force of arms. So they are trying to do it by creating trade laws that allow them to control this in any case. So since the biodiversity is primarily with the poorer countries, 80% is with the poorer countries, the only way the rich countries can control it is by introducing intellectual property rights.
Another ongoing battle is the one against agricultural subsidies.
Most of the poorer nations are basically agricultural nations. Now, there is a rule in the WTO that prevents dumping. Dumping means selling a product in the international market at a price lower than what one spent to produce it. Obviously, the poorer countries are at an advantage here because their labor is cheaper. To overcome this, the rich countries give huge subsidies to their farmers, so the farmer can claim that they've actually spent less on producing grain than what a poorer country farmer is spending. As a result, in the international market, the richer countries can sell at a lower rate. This is clearly an unjust way of circumventing the rules, and the poorer countries are demanding that these agricultural subsidies should be removed. And it was precisely on this ground that the meeting at Cancun, Mexico broke down.
Globalization has two dimensions. Globalization is not always an unhealthy thing, as sometimes it's made out to be. I think what people are questioning is the kind of globalization happening today, which is what we would broadly call imperialist globalization, where it's an unequal relationship. Otherwise, globalization is a healthy thing if cultures can talk to each other and people can interact across the world. And usually the kind of globalization we see today is what you would call a capital intensive globalization, which means that only capital has the liberty to move or freedom to move, not labor.
Now we have sophisticated instruments available to diagnose early and probably treat early. So that means you have to pay, the equipments are expensive, so somebody has to pay for it. So usually the end user, the patient, the cost goes up.
Companies today are global companies, and it is the corporates which govern a lot of our governments today. So the role of a corporate, the role of companies which are global companies, is of immense value. And it's not going to diminish, it's only going to increase. They're not just going to influence the way organizations work, they're going to influence the way the world functions. And we cannot turn a blind eye to that.
As we stand at a crossroad on our journey towards globalization, Gandhi's talisman comes to mind. Recall the faces of the poorest and the weakest. Then ask yourself if the step you contemplate is going to be of any use to them. Will they gain anything by it? Will it restore their control over their own lives and destinies? Do we then need to take another look at the face of globalization?